Welcome back to Russian Khton. Today's original story takes us inside a bleak post-Soviet courtyard, where a hidden masterpiece is waiting to break a decade of tragic silence. Let's begin.
The brutal, suffocating heat of a late June afternoon had settled over the provincial city like a heavy woolen blanket. Arseny, a 24-year-old solfeggio teacher at the local children's music school, stood on his cramped third-floor balcony, sipping instant coffee from a chipped mug. His summer vacation had officially begun, stretching before him like a vast, empty wasteland of lazy mornings and aimless evenings. From his vantage point, Arseny looked down into the Dvor, the courtyard formed by a square of 5-story, pale gray panel buildings known as Khrushchevkas. In Russia, the Dvor is not just a yard. It is a micro-society, a self-contained universe. In the center stood a rusting playground from the Soviet era, shaped like a rocket ship. To the left, a couple of men in undershirts were silently smoking by dilapidated tin garages, and by the entrance to Arseny's building sat the ultimate tribunal, 3 elderly women, babushkas, occupying the wooden bench, ruthlessly washing the bones of every passerby, a Russian idiom for gossiping with forensic precision. Arseny's eyes drifted from the bench to a figure slowly shuffling toward the heavy iron door of the podiyezd, the communal stairwell that acts as a purgatory between the unforgiving street and the sanctuary of the apartments. It was the old man from the 4th floor. No one seemed to know his name, but everyone knew to avoid him. He was a hunched, unkempt figure who looked older than the crumbling brickwork of the building itself. He wore a heavy, faded tweed coat despite the 30-degree heat, and his silver hair was matted against his skull. He emanated a profound, prickly hostility, snapping at anyone who held the door for him and refusing to make eye contact. The babushkas usually went quiet when he passed, only to erupt in a flurry of whispers the moment the iron door slammed shut behind him. But Arseny, being a musician, noticed something the babushkas didn't. Tucked tightly under the old man's arm, gripped with a tenderness that contradicted his entire existence, was a battered black leather violin case. It was scuffed, the brass latches green with oxidation, but the way the man carried it, shielding it from the sun, keeping it close to his heart, spoke volumes. Arseny had tried to greet him a few times, offering a cheerful "Zdravstvuyte," only to be met with a guttural grunt. The man was a fortress. But today, looking down at the slow, painful progress the old man was making, Arseny felt a sudden, inexplicable pang of that famous Russian zhalost, a deep, almost painful compassion that demands action. He couldn't just knock on the door and say hello. In a panelka, you don't breach someone's privacy without a reason. You need a delo, a concrete matter of business. Arseny stepped back into his apartment, his eyes scanning his messy living room until they landed on an old, beaten-up acoustic guitar leaning against the radiator. It was a cheap Soviet Leningrad factory guitar, its strings rusted and the tuning pegs stiff with age. It was the perfect alibi. 10 minutes later, Arseny was standing in front of apartment 42 on the 4th floor. The door was upholstered in peeling, dark red dermantine, a cheap leather substitute popular in the 90s for insulation. The doorbell had been ripped out, leaving only 2 wires sticking out of the plaster like dead insect antennas. Arseny knocked. Silence. He knocked louder. "Excuse me. Hello? It's your neighbor from downstairs." He waited, feeling foolish. He was about to turn around when the lock clicked with the heavy metallic clank of a bank vault. The door opened an inch, secured by a tarnished chain. A single bloodshot eye peered out from the darkness. "What do you want?" The voice was like dry leaves scraping across asphalt. "Good afternoon," Arseny said, holding up the guitar like a shield. "My name is Arseny. I live below you. I saw you with a violin case. I assume you have absolute pitch? I'm a pianist. My ears are ruined by a bad cold, and the pegs on this old guitar are completely jammed. I was hoping, relying na avos on pure luck, that you might know how to loosen them and help me tune it." The eye blinked. The mention of pitch, the polite musical terminology, it momentarily short-circuited the old man's defensive programming. He looked at the guitar, then at Arseny. With a heavy sigh, the door closed, the chain rattled, and the door swung wide open. "Make it quick," the old man grumbled. He snatched the guitar from Arseny's hands with surprising speed. His long, calloused fingers, the fingers of a master, ran over the cheap wood. He didn't even look closely at the stuck peg. He simply clamped his thumb over the rusty gear, applied a sudden, precise, brutal pressure, and it cracked loose with a sharp snap. He gave it a quick twist, plucked the rusty string, and adjusted it effortlessly until it hummed a perfect E. He shoved the guitar back into Arseny's chest. Learn the mechanics of your instrument, pianist. Now get out. But Arseny didn't step back. He let the guitar slide to the floor, resting against the wall, his eyes finally moving past the old man. The breath was knocked out of his lungs. He had expected a mess. He had expected the smell of unwashed clothes and old age. He had not expected an absolute, terrifying void. The apartment was stripped entirely bare. There was no furniture, none. The faded, flower-patterned Soviet wallpaper had been violently peeled away in strips, revealing raw, gray concrete beneath. Dust motes danced lazily in the single shaft of sunlight piercing through the filthy window. In the center of the main room lay a stained, bare mattress. Next to it was a small pile of rags, an empty plastic water bottle, and the black violin case, resting on a relatively clean piece of cloth like an altar in a ruined temple. The air smelled thick and sour, the heavy, suffocating odor of a life that had ground to a halt. "Close the door," the old man snapped, noticing Arseny's stare. He walked back and sat heavily on the edge of the mattress. Up close, his face was a map of deep ravines, his skin a sickly, ashen gray. "My God," Arseny breathed, stepping entirely over the threshold. "What happened here? How do you live like this? Where is your furniture? Where is your family?" The old man's head snapped up, his eyes burning with sudden fierce pride. "I did not invite you in for an inspection, boy. Take your firewood and get out." "No," Arseny said, his voice trembling slightly, but his feet rooted to the floor. "I'm not leaving. You're sleeping on concrete." The old man looked at Arseny, his chest heaving under the thick coat. For a moment, it looked like he was going to attack the younger man. But then, the anger simply drained out of him, leaving behind something much worse. Absolute, crushing exhaustion. He slumped forward, resting his face in his trembling hands. "They are gone," he whispered. 10 years ago. A drunk driver on the highway to Moscow. My wife, my daughter. The fire took the car. It took everything." He slowly raised his head, looking around the empty, concrete room as if seeing ghosts. "For years I drank. I sold the piano, the carpets, the books, just to silence the memories. But grief is an expensive habit. A couple of years ago, the pension wasn't enough anymore. I sold the bed, the chairs, the table, just to pay the communal bills so they wouldn't shut off the water, and to buy bread. I peeled the wallpaper myself because the flowers reminded me of her summer dresses. And then, I just sat down on this mattress to wait for death. But death is a cruel bureaucrat. It keeps losing my paperwork. But the violin?" Arseny pointed to the case. "A musician does not sell his soul," the old man said softly, "even if the strings are broken." Arseny felt a lump form in his throat. He recognized the man's face now, hidden beneath the grime and the beard. He had seen it on a faded black-and-white portrait in the director's office at the music school. "You're Ilya Borisovich," Arseny breathed. "You were the first violin of the Regional Philharmonic. You played Tchaikovsky in Moscow." Ilya Borisovich looked away, his jaw tightening. "Ilya Borisovich died on that highway. I am just the ghost that was left behind to haunt this box. Go away, Arseny. Let the dead rest." Arseny didn't say a word. He turned around, unlocked the door, and left. But he didn't go back to his apartment to drink coffee. He went straight down to the street, bypassing the babushkas, and walked to the hardware store 2 blocks away. When Arseny returned an hour later, he didn't knock. He kicked the door with his boot. He carried 2 heavy plastic buckets, a mop, a broom, a small mountain of sponges, and 5 bottles of heavy-duty industrial cleaner. Ilya Borisovich opened the door, staring at the arsenal in Arseny's hands in bewilderment. "What is this?" "This," Arseny said, pushing past the old man into the apartment, "is a sabbatnik. In Russian culture, a sabbatnik is a day of unpaid, communal volunteer work, a relic of the Soviet era that had ingrained itself into the national DNA. When someone declares a sabbatnik, you don't argue. You grab a rag." "Are you insane?" the old man yelled, finding his voice. "Get out of my house." "No," Arseny said firmly, tying a bandana over his nose and mouth. He walked into the tiny kitchen, turned on the tap, and began filling the bucket. You can yell at me. You can hit me with the broom. You can call the police. But I am not leaving until this place smells like pine needles and bleach. You are a maestro, Ilya Borisovich, and a maestro does not sleep on bare concrete. For a long time, the old man just stood in the doorway, trembling with a mix of rage and shock. But Arseny ignored him. He dropped to his knees and began scrubbing the floors, attacking the grime with a frantic, desperate energy. Perhaps it was the sheer audacity of the young man, or perhaps Ilya Borisovich simply lacked the physical strength to throw him out. He retreated to his mattress, pulling his knees to his chest, and watched in silence as the boy scrubbed. That evening, Arseny went back to his own apartment, utterly exhausted, smelling of chlorine and dust. But before he went to sleep, he made a cup of strong tea, sat at his laptop, and opened VKontakte, the most popular Russian social network. He found the official page of the Regional Philharmonic. He found the alumni group of the music college. He wrote a single, long post. He didn't ask for money. He didn't post a tragedy. He simply wrote the truth. Ilya Borisovich, the man who taught half of this city how to hold a bow, is alive, but he is living in an empty room, sleeping on the floor. I am spending my vacation cleaning his home. If anyone remembers the music he gave us, we could use a chair, or a mattress, or just a memory. He clicked publish, relying entirely on the theory of 6 handshakes, the deep-seated Russian belief that through a chain of no more than 6 acquaintances, you can reach anyone in the country. The next morning, Arseny woke up to 54 unread messages. What followed was not just a week of change, it was a phenomenon. The Dvor had always been a place of gossip, but it was also a place of fierce, protective community. When the babushkas on the bench learned who exactly was living in apartment 42, their attitude shifted from suspicion to a militant, maternal mobilization. On Tuesday, Auntie Masha from the first floor marched up the stairs carrying a massive, steaming pot of borscht, pushing past Arseny to set it down in the now sparkling kitchen. You are too thin, Ilya Borisovich, she barked, brooking no argument. Eat. I will check the pot later. On Wednesday, 2 burly men from the adjacent building, who usually spent their evenings drinking beer by the garages, carried a heavy, polished, Soviet-era wardrobe up 4 flights of stairs. My mother used to listen to you on the radio, one of them mumbled awkwardly, setting it against the wall. Good to have you back, maestro. On Thursday, an armchair arrived, then a small television, then curtains, thick and heavy, brought by a woman who had once failed her entrance exams to the conservatory, but remembered the kind old man who had handed her a handkerchief when she cried. Through it all, Ilya Borisovich remained in a state of quiet shock. He sat in his new armchair, eating hot borscht, watching the stream of people moving through his apartment. The hostility had melted away, replaced by a profound, trembling bewilderment. He had spent 10 years convinced that the world had forgotten him, only to discover that the world was just waiting for a reason to remember. By Saturday, the apartment felt like a home. It was modest, slightly mismatched, but it was clean, warm, and alive. Arseny was in the kitchen, brewing tea in a chipped teapot, when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the front door. Ilya Borisovich opened it. Standing on the landing were 3 people in suits. Leading them was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair, the current director of the Regional Philharmonic. Ilya, the director said softly, it's been a long time. Ilya Borisovich grabbed the door frame, his knuckles turning white. Victor, I don't have enough chairs for you all. We didn't come to sit, Victor said, stepping inside. He gestured to the woman behind him. She opened a sleek, modern velvet case to reveal a master-crafted violin bow, its horsehair pure white and taut, and a sealed packet of Parastro Eva Peradze gold strings. We brought you new wings, Ilya, Victor said gently, but a bird needs its bones set right before it can fly. 10 years in this apartment, enduring the summer heat and the winter draft. The wood is parched, the glue is brittle, the soundpost is probably dropped. Give me the violin. Let me take it to Grigori, our master luthier. Let him treat the wood and breathe life back into it. Ilya Borisovich froze. His hands trembled wildly. That battered black case was his only anchor to the world, the only thing he hadn't sold to buy a few more days of a miserable existence. To let it out of his sight felt like tearing out his own heart. But he looked into Victor's eyes, and then over at Arseny, standing quietly in the kitchen. The old man gave a slow, shaky nod and handed the black case over. 3 days later, Victor returned. When he opened the case on Ilya's new dining table, the instrument inside was transformed. It was polished, restored, glowing with an amber warmth. The internal soundpost had been perfectly reset by the luthier, the micro cracks sealed, and the golden parastro strings were strung taut, waiting to sing. The next evening, the oppressive heat broke, giving way to a cool, golden twilight. The Devor was alive. The children were screaming on the playground, the men were arguing about football by the garages, and the babushkas were at their post on the bench. Arseny was walking back from the grocery store, a loaf of fresh bread under his arm, when he heard it. It was a single, piercing note, pure, resonant, and impossibly clear. It cut through the noise of the courtyard like a silver thread. The children stopped running. The men by the garages went silent, their cigarettes burning down to their fingers. The babushkas turned their heads, their hands frozen in their laps. Arseny looked up. There, standing on his narrow fourth-floor balcony, dressed in a clean white shirt that Auntie Masha had ironed for him, was Ilya Borisovich. He had the restored violin tucked firmly under his chin, his eyes closed, the setting sun catching the gleaming varnish of the wood. He drew the new bow across the strings, and the courtyard filled with the breathtaking, heartbreaking melody of Rachmaninoff's Vocalise. It wasn't a technically flawless performance. The old man's fingers were stiff from a decade of disuse, and occasionally a note would quiver. But the emotion, the sheer, raw, bleeding soul pouring out of the instrument, transcended perfection. The wood, healed by the luthier, resonated with an aching depth. The music wept for a lost wife, mourned for a gone daughter, and sang of the crushing, beautiful weight of being alive. The melody didn't just fill the courtyard, it stitched it together. It flowed into the open fortochkas, the small ventilation windows of the apartments, reaching the people cooking dinners and watching TV. It wrapped around the panel walls, hiding the chipped paint and the rusted pipes, turning the ordinary, gritty Soviet courtyard into a cathedral of sound. Down on the bench, Auntie Masha wiped her eyes with the corner of her headscarf. The tough guys by the garages stared at the asphalt, completely, utterly still. When the final, lingering note faded into the evening air, there was a long, suspended silence. For a moment, the world simply stopped spinning. And then, from the bench, Auntie Masha began to clap. The men by the garages joined in. The children clapped. Windows opened across all 5 floors, and applause rained down into the courtyard, echoing off the concrete walls, a standing ovation from a neighborhood that had found its soul. Up on the 4th-floor balcony, Ilya Borisovich lowered the violin. He looked down at the faces of his neighbors, at the people he had hidden from for so long. He looked at Arseny, standing by the entrance with a loaf of bread, smiling broadly. The old man didn't run inside. He didn't scowl. Slowly, with a trembling, profound dignity, he bowed his head. The ghost of apartment 42 was gone. The maestro had returned.
It's a powerful reminder that even the heaviest grief can be healed when a neighborhood decides to find its collective soul through music. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.